Welcome back to another episode of Spiritual Honesty. I'm Pastor Brad, along again with Pastor Randy.
Yep.
I'm really impressed. A collared shirt.
Oh, absolutely.
You're stepping up.
Oh, yeah.
It must be all the residuals from the show. You got bought new clothing, right?
That's right. That's right.
We're delighted to be with you again today, and we're going to talk about something that's really important in the church, especially right now. Mm-hmm. Depending on when you're watching this, COVID is once again threatening church services all across the country, and really all across the world. Mm-hmm. It was the spring of 2020, I guess, that churches started having to shut down, and we may be facing that prospect again. Now, because of that, a lot of churches really kind of stepped up with their online presence. Mm-hmm. And more services, more material, and they were trying to preach the gospel just in a different way, electronically. And that's what we want to think about today. The impact of technology on the modern church and whether that's a good thing or not. Well, why don't we just start with that question? Mm-hmm. What do you think?
Is it a good thing? Oh, it's good and bad, both. Because it's good, because there's another form of getting the word out to people that for some reason just prefer not to come to church and not to hear the word. So it's actually reaching them where they're at and possibly encouraging them to come back into the fellowship. But that's the good part. But the bad is it gives people the chance to sit in their PJs and go, yeah, I'll watch church. I don't have to show up anymore. And basically they got their cup of coffee, but then what'll happen is something else will draw them away and they'll go, I'll watch next week. That's fine. And then it's the next week and the next week, and they fall away.
Well, hold on to those thoughts.
Okay.
We'll come back and talk about those. We want to introduce our verse right now from 1 Corinthians 9:22, where Paul says, I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. Now, that's going to figure into our discussion, which we will talk about. But what do you think about that verse? Because he prefaced that by saying, to the Jews, I became a Jew. To the weak, I became weak. What are your initial thoughts about that verse and what he's talking about?
I think he's dead on, which is I have become to reach those that don't want to come. I have found a way to utilize the tools to reach them.
Okay.
And reach more people.
Which fits in exactly with our discussion. And
yes.
We'll come back to that in just a second. But first we want to introduce you to someone who is well versed on this topic, this whole idea of, for lack of a better term, the electronic church. It looks like a Sunday morning service and sounds like one too. But other than the pastors and musicians, this service has no one in attendance. It's streamed online for a vast, unseen audience.
In fact, if you have a need right now, I encourage you, type it into the chat.
A virtual church hosted by Life Church, headquartered in Oklahoma. Every week, Life Church offers nearly 100 such services, free of charge, to any church that's interested.
I'm so excited you're looking into online ministry. At no other time in history have more tools been available to us as the church to reach the lost in our towns, countries, and around the world.
Life Church is one of the more ambitious online providers, but almost every church, no matter how big or small, has entered the digital space. Online worship has gone from novelty to necessity for those congregations unable to meet in person during the COVID pandemic.
We're in a season right now in the church and with all of our congregations that we have to reimagine what ministry looks like in this pandemic era that we're living in. I wish I could say post-pandemic era, but it doesn't seem like we can say that quite yet.
Everyone, it seems, is jumping on the online bandwagon, even if they're not sure how to do it or what it should look like. Very few are asking the hard spiritual questions about the online experience. For example, what about online communion? For someone watching at home, is this a valid communion experience? Can true gathering and sharing be experienced without a physical presence?
The danger is in going back and updating the classical, ancient, original definition of church to be something less than the physical gathering of God's people.
When we start to speak of worship as something in which we receive primarily, and not as an act in which we offer, I think we lose the biblical definition, if you call it, or at least the biblical demonstration of what worship is.
These are all questions that must be worked out. But in the meantime, the push to go online continues, full steam ahead, with no signs of slowing down. Well, there's no doubt the church needs to be in the electronic space because that's where people are. But how much is too much, and when do you cross the line from helpful to potentially harmful?
Right, exactly.
I'm asking you.
Oh, you're asking. Oh, geez, I thought you were making a statement.
Oh, heavens no.
Yeah.
It's got a question mark at the end of it. That's an interrogation.
Okay,
so.
There you go.
So how do we figure that out?
Oh, your guess is as good as mine.
So we're still kind of working our way
Yep.
through this.
Yep, we will. We're going to find that we'll have a great amount of people at the beginning that will participate and see the show, and or not show the service.
Yeah.
And they'll be all excited, but because they don't have a lot of soil, they don't have deep roots, it's going to wither.
Okay, so we're talking about the parable of the sower.
Oh yes.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
And some seed fell on the rocky ground, and some seed didn't have much depth of soil.
Right.
So that all plays into it. Is this just another evolutionary turn in really how technology's impacted the church? Because when you think about it, you go back to the late 1400s. The Reformation is not even possible without the printing press. And so that was the first great technological breakthrough that brought the message to a whole bunch of people. So this seems to be just another step, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. Oh, I think it's an awesome step. Let me see. God's greatest invention, well, not greatest, but one of his awesome inventions was the computer, and it was a great asset to the church, and it's a great asset to theological studies, and because you can go onto Google and Google anything that you want, and it's a great tool, but that's just it. It's only a tool. When we allow technology to be the end all, then we are in pretty bad shape.
Well, let's take a look at how one church is using that tool to get into that online space and is trying to figure out this whole issue. Well, we're going to switch gears a little bit here. We're not going to talk to someone at a church, but we're going to talk to someone who works with a lot of churches. Matt Burke from the Indiana Center for Congregations. Matt, welcome. We thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. Appreciate the invitation.
First of all, for people who don't know, what is the Indiana Center for Congregations and what does it do?
Yeah, so the Center for Congregations, we're a small nonprofit that serve Indiana congregations. We try to help them find and use resources, basically to help them address challenges and opportunities that they're facing, and just help them get the right information and expertise into their hands so they can take next steps forward.
I would think one of those challenges would be the challenge of the electronic church and digital technology and online services. I imagine this is a topic of great interest to what you guys are doing there, and you have discussed it thoroughly.
Yeah, when the pandemic hit, of course, everyone needed to find technological solutions. And so everyone's interests converged very much on that topic, which made us do a lot of research on that topic and talk to a lot of experts. And so we've tried to help a lot of congregations learn how to do better with online.
What specifically is your background in that, your experience?
Sure. Yeah. Before I came to the Center for Congregations, I was in for-profit education, in online education for about 6 years. And so learned a lot about adult learning styles and especially how that works in online education. And so not only did we help congregations shift and pivot to using technology, but we moved our education events to virtual, and we hosted probably about 130 education events online since the pandemic started in early 20.
Have you had a lot of conversations with congregations and councils and pastors about this? And if so, what do those conversations look like?
Yeah, we've definitely had a lot of conversations with a lot of congregational leaders. And the conversations, they range from across a wide range of issues, from anything from just kind of basic tech, like settings and just how do you make stuff work, but all the way through how do we create engagement? How do we do this where people feel connected, even though we're using technology and in a virtual space? So it can be kind of very brass tacks tips and practical components, all the way through how do we understand what it means to be a community when we're not physically present together.
Well, that's really the big question, isn't it? The idea of how do we create a spiritual community online? So what answers are you getting back?
Yeah, it really varies a lot in terms of, each congregation has a unique way that they gather and a function of their gathering. I think about the sanctuary setup in brick and mortar spaces where, some sanctuaries, the pulpit is front and center because that means for that congregation, the word is the central and most important feature of what they do in Sunday worship. For others, the speaker's podium is to the side and the communion table is front and center. So for that congregation, the Eucharist is the most important thing. And so I think what we've learned is virtual engagement depends a lot on how the congregation views its community and what are the central features. Is it most important to just stream the service and the explication of the word is the most important piece? Or is the community building and ability for people to see and speak with one another, is that most important? And that really guides how technology gets used depending on the congregation's answer to that question.
What sense do you have in terms of how many churches that you deal with are now engaged in this digital space? I would imagine it's got to be up 80-90%, I would think.
Yeah, if I had to do a back of the envelope number, that would have been the very same numbers I would have given. It's very rare to find a congregation at this point, at least that we encounter, that is not using technology, virtual technology in some way, shape, or form.
So when they come to you, or when you go to them, what are the questions that are foremost on their minds in terms of this online experience?
Yeah, probably the single key question right now is how do you create a sustainable hybrid experience? And people use the term hybrid a lot, but technically what it means in virtual education, and I think what congregations are trying to wrestle with, is how do you deal with both an audience that's physically present in the sanctuary, but also an audience that's online, and serving both of those populations well. And it's a very tricky thing to do.
Have you found churches that are doing it well? Or can we even know if they're doing it well at this point?
Yeah, it's. I think we're all at the beginning stages of learning this. I mean, there are, of course, some congregations, and in my understanding, in Australia and some European countries, they've been doing this kind of thing for a long time. And so we're digging into and trying to find some experts and wisdom in those worlds. But in the United States, it's a pretty new thing. Although some congregations have been doing it for a while, many, this is a new landscape and a new space. And, some of the things that are important, I think, are or things that we have seen done well are congregations. Some of them have invested in a new position of an online pastor. And so it's someone who it is their sole responsibility to essentially be the caretaker and the shepherd of those who are engaging solely in the virtual space. And so I think it's important for congregations to think about that you may not have the budget, you may not have the capacity or ability to hire someone, but you do need someone who has a focus on that in building relationships with the people who are online and only engaging online, assessing what their experience is like. How do we make this better? How do we make you feel more a part of the community? I think that's an absolutely crucial part of our new world moving forward.
That's interesting you mentioned that thing about hiring online pastors, because I've seen those ads out there as well, mainly for the bigger churches. Mm-hmm. So are we seeing perhaps a digital divide here between the smaller churches that don't have the resources and the bigger churches that have the money and the resources? And are those smaller churches in danger of being left behind?
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think there definitely is a digital divide, and even just down to internet access, that in a lot of the rural congregations in Indiana, there are some that just do not have access to reliable internet. And so that's been a perennial issue. There are some solutions coming down the line and coming online at this point. But that's still a problem that some congregations, some of them were very innovative with using FM transmitters. So rather than doing internet, they would find a way to transmit so people would have drive-in church because they didn't have access to the internet. And so there have been some really innovative ways that congregations have wrestled with that. But I think there definitely is a divide. There's a resource divide and also an access divide. But one thing that we have seen is some of the smaller congregations that may not have the financial resources have begun to tap into some of their youth or young adults and used their technological expertise to be able to help in some cases. And that's been successful, not only in just the bare fact of using technology, but also getting younger people involved in the life of the congregation in new and innovative ways.
Well, that's really interesting that you mentioned about energizing and involving young people, because there seems to be a divide related to age as well. Have you noticed that perhaps older congregations and people are less willing to engage in this space and are having more trouble adjusting to it?
Yeah, in some instances, that's definitely been the case that we've heard from some congregational leaders that the congregation really just wants to get back to normal. They just want to be back in the brick and mortar space because the level of conversancy with technology isn't as high. The adaptability to the technology is a little more difficult. And so we've definitely heard that. But on the flip side of it, we've also heard really encouraging stories of congregants who are maybe in assisted living spaces where at this point they feel more connected now than they used to because there are digital or virtual options. And so I think there's both sides of it. There are in older populations that may not be as comfortable with technology. There sometimes is reluctance to adapt to it, but in other cases, it's actually been a great boon for getting those folks reconnected with the congregation that they have been a part of for a very long time.
I've got a friend in Dallas who goes to a fairly large church down there, and he said they were shut down for long stretches of time during COVID, and they consumed their worship experience online. Well, now that they've opened back up, he tells me, you know what, it's just easier for us to get up, go to church now at home in our pajamas. You don't have to drive, you don't have to. Is that a potential danger involved with this situation? That we're going to lose people's desire to go to quote unquote regular church?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, I don't know about a danger. I think it's definitely a challenge. But you think about, what the automobile did for the United States and how we've created suburban communities, and a lot of people drive 30 minutes, 45 minutes into their church at this point. So there's an argument that they're not as connected geographically into the neighborhoods as they used to be. And I think there's some challenges with that congregations, I think, have a harder time getting involved in their local community because the people who attend the congregation may be from a very diverse and spread out geographic region. And so that's a challenge that we've had to wrestle with. And I think that the opportunity for people to stay at home, drink their coffee on the couch is a challenge, but I don't know that it's an insurmountable challenge. And what I hope for, what I'm optimistic about, is that congregations will begin to find ways to remember, this is why it's important for us to gather in person, and will find compelling ways to get people to come back in person, because I don't think we were designed to be separated like this. And so I think, the sharing of meals, that we've not had that luxury over the last year and a half, and finding, rediscovering the joys of gathering together and finding ways to create events and environments where people want to come back. And so maybe they'll still watch Sunday service from the comfort of home, but maybe there will be other options and opportunities for people to gather together as we should do as congregational communities.
Well, I know you've talked to a lot of churches and a lot of pastors and a lot of church leaders, have you also talked to congregation members? Do we have a sense of what they're looking for and what they want from all this?
Yeah, it's we have a little bit of a sense of that, and honestly, it's a mixed bag. There are some who very much enjoy the opportunity because maybe it is a longer drive to be able to stay at home and just be a part of the service remotely because maybe they already have really good contacts and friendships within the congregation that help sustain them week in and week out. But other people very much want to get back into the physical space because of the comfort of singing together and being physically gathered with everyone. So I don't know that we can paint a picture of kind of the typical congregant because a lot of people want a lot of different things. But again, my hope is that we can kind of sift and sort and find the best ways to be congregations, and especially reimagining or re-understanding the identity of a given congregation to utilize the technology in ways that will strengthen the ministry as opposed to, kind of creating barriers or creating problems.
Is there a sense that congregations are trying to do something different, or is there a need to do something different beyond simply taking the Sunday service and throwing it online? Is there something in the online experience that should be different than coming to church on Sunday morning?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think there needs to be some innovation. We had a presenter, Jason Moore, who came in and spoke to people about doing church online, and he recalled when film began, they would set up a camera kind of at the best seat of a playhouse and essentially film the play happening on stage. And of course, you think about how filmmaking is very different now because when the medium started, it's like, oh, well, we can just record the plays and show the plays. But as the medium developed and innovation happened, now you have, close-up facial shots or, different sets, people in homes, and now they're even using drones in a lot of cases to film. And it changed the dynamic of how storytelling is done. And I think in a like way, now we have an opportunity where the typical congregational experience is you have a stage and people sit in rows and participate in some way of what's happening on stage. But now perhaps there are opportunities to innovate and think, how can we now leverage this new medium and this new experience to make it a more robust engagement and encounter with our sacred stories and with what we want to see happening in our worship services.
And finally, let me ask you, is there very much still a sense that this is a new unknown frontier, that we are kind of going out into the great unknown?
Yeah, very much so. I think that I'm excited to see, because we've already seen a good level of innovation and creativity in congregations just in the last 18 months. And I think as virtual technology becomes the new norm for most, if not all, congregations, I think we're going to really see some creativity and innovation. But we don't have the answers to those questions yet. It's very much an unknown, and there's still a lot of unanswered questions.
Matt Burke from the Indiana Center for Congregations, we thank you for taking time with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me here. Appreciate it.
Well, is this simply another generation gap issue? Is this just the difference between young and old, where the old people, once they start to kind of pass from the scene, this won't be an issue anymore?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that the argument of being able to use the internet for, worship service, etc., that will become, that will go away as we get more comfortable with the internet, etc. It'll become much more acceptable. But do I think it is replacing the fellowship of believers? Absolutely not.
That's the key question. Because I think of a verse like Hebrews 10:23, do not forsake the assembly.
Yep.
Are we forsaking the assembly by consuming the worship experience electronically?
Personally, I'm an old guy. So personally, I really do think so. I think that we have lost the intimacy of worship and the encouraging of each other by coming together. We talked about it just the other night, that the coming together is so important, because when you're sitting there personally and you can look somebody right in the eye and you find a way to encourage them, that somebody's being discouraged, whatever, you can't do that electronically. They can write in questions, etc., but you don't have that personal, it's very removed.
Well, for good or for bad, it's here, and it's growing, and I believe there are some churches that are actually moving toward completely online services. No physical presence whatsoever. So this is an issue that is going to continue to evolve.
No, absolutely.
Why don't we take a look at our viewer question this time around, which is really an interesting one. Why does God forgive evil? That's a really interesting question when you think about it. Why does God forgive evil? And I'm guessing the person that wrote this out was thinking, you know what, those evil people don't deserve to be forgiven. That just is a total guess, but that's what I'm thinking. My sins aren't quite so bad because I'm not evil.
Exactly.
But somebody like Hitler or something, that's evil. And why would God forgive that? So what do you think?
Tell you what, if I'm going to start to judge and compare, and my sins aren't quite as bad, so I'm forgivable, we're all doomed, because the only one that can actually say that is Jesus. And he did. And he died for all of our sins. So why does God forgive evil? I actually thank God that he does forgive.
And I think that's the key. We can't pretend to understand the mind of God. But why does God forgive evil? We don't know. Out of love for his creation. But however and why he decided to do it, thank goodness he did. Because evil, we can't distinguish between evil and non-evil. It's sin in any form. And we're all deserving of condemnation and wrath. So the idea that God will forgive sin and evil, that's the blessing, because that's what we need. And I agree with you. If we start categorizing people into bad sin over here, not so bad, evil, not evil, we're in a heap of trouble.
Oh, yes.
Okay. Very good. Thank you for that question. And if you'd like to get a question on your show, feel free to email it to me, and perhaps you can be on a future edition of Spiritual Honesty. That will do it for our program today. We thank you for joining us, and thank you for being here in person.
Oh, well,
and
thank
not electronic. For Pastor Randy, I'm Pastor Brad, thanking you again and saying we will see you soon on another edition of Spiritual Honesty. Funding for this program has been made in part through a generous donation by Fisher Seeds of Shelbyville, Indiana. Fisher, grow, nourish, thrive.